Okay, this is the second of the series, Jewish Background of the Bible, Part 2, Judaism Today. The three ethnic groups, Ashkenazi Jews, it's the predominant culture in Israel. If you look around the world, Western culture has kind of taken over most of the world. Okay, our jackets, our ties, our dress codes. Now, not in some places that have Sharia law, but Western culture has predominated. And in Israel, where you had maybe half from the east, half from the west, there was certainly have been battles, mainly cultural, about whose culture is going to have control. We'll talk more about that later. Predominant culture in Israel, even at 50% of the population, and that was many years ago, was Ashkenazi. David Ben-Gurion was the first prime minister of Israel. By the way, in Israel, the prime minister has the power. The president is a figurehead. He wanted Ashkenazi culture to predominate. That they came from places they were more educated. They were sort of like Eastern and Central Europe. Ashkenazi Jews tended to have more education. Ben Gurion himself came from one of those countries. And it was basically he wanted that culture to predominate. Sephardic Jews. Obadiah 120 has that word, Sephard. So Sephard is the Hebrew word for Spain. Thrown out of Spain, they just adopted it from Obadiah 120. They're thrown out of Spain in 1492. You know, when Columbus came to America, the same year the Jews were kicked out of Spain.
They gave the order the day that he set sail.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
They were kicked out of Portugal in 1497. They were given warning in 1496. Developed their own language called Ladino. It's Judeo-Spanish. Part Hebrew, part Spanish.
Wow.
They went to the Middle East, the Balkans, places like that. Mizrahi Jews, also called Arab Jews, because they've lived in Arab countries. Remember the Babylonian dispersion? Well, when Ezra and Nehemiah, most of the Jews did not come back. Most of the Jews stayed. They were comfortable. They didn't all come back. They had a community, you know, there's a New Testament epistle where it mentions Babylon, and people say, well, that means Rome. I'm not even talking Revelation. No, there's a Jewish community in Babylon for hundreds of years back then, because most of the Jews did not come back. Who goes to frontiers? The Wild West, Alaska. I've lived in both places, by the way. Generally, in the old days, not the satisfied, the dissatisfied. But they lived in Arab lands. They can be mistaken for Arabs. You know, there's always intermarriage due to physical appearance, or even they can be mistaken for Sephardic Jews. Sephardic Jews, some of them ended up in some of these Arab countries, and most people look at it as Ashkenazi and Sephardic. Don't even know about this group. Never heard about them when I was a kid. And they're often sort of grouped together. And sometimes when people take to the streets after an Arab attack, and you know, sometimes the Jews will get really upset and start attacking Arabs and stuff like that. They'll see Mizrahi Jews and attack them, not realizing that they're actually Jewish. Now, I can remember 1979, I was on an Ulpan, a Hebrew study, Kibbutz Ulpan. We'll talk about that more later. Hebrew study program in Israel. And my roommate was Persian. By the way, Persians are not Arabs. There are Turks, there are Arabs, and there are Persians. Now, they are different groups. But there were a bunch of Persians, because that was the year Khomeini said, we don't need the Jews, get them out of here. So there were a bunch of disgruntled Persians, because they had professional, you know, they had degrees, they had careers, and all of a sudden they had to leave and come to Israel because Khomeini made it very difficult for them, leaving behind perhaps families and stuff like that. And these Persians look, you know, they look kind of Arab. Now, of course, Arabs aren't Persians, but they look like Persians. They look like Iranians because of the intermarriage. My roommate had been a captain in the Shah's army because he had to get out. He showed me his picture, in his uniform. There's an interesting story that he went, under the law of return, you can say, I'm Jewish, and you can become a citizen. Well, they didn't know if Khomeini was sending in infiltrators. So they didn't know whether to believe. And he says, I've been circumcised. And there's a woman behind the desk as he told the story. And he showed her he'd been circumcised. She said, so what? A Muslim can be circumcised. Okay? My Hebrew teacher found out about this, and we all had to do skits at the end of the Ulpan. So the Hebrew teacher wrote the skit, and I was the person behind the desk, and this other Persian was the guy that was trying to prove his identity. And that other Persian looked very much like something I saw on TV. They had that rescue from Iran where, what's that rich, Ross Perot financed it. He wasn't involved as a, not commander, what do you call those? Well, anyway, it wasn't one of the people. They had some Americans that were taken hostage during that time of all the upheaval. Now, not the big one that everybody knows about, but some people with some company. And they put it on, they made a TV movie out of it. What do you call it? Not a terrorist. Commando, I think it is. They had people that went in from that company and actually had to try to break these people, and successfully broke them out of jail.
Commandos?
Commandos, yeah.
Commandos, yeah.
Commandos, I'm thinking. And I remember the guy who played one of the Persian that basically said, come on, here, we got to talk to you guys before you leave the country, and they ended up being taken hostage, put in jail. Looked very much like this guy that played the part with me in the Ulpan at that skit at the end. There's always intermarriage and there's confusion. If you can understand everything I just said. Okay, Judaism of the Talmud predominates today. Okay, now I was a kid, I went to Hebrew school. You go to Sunday school for 2 hours, and then you go either Tuesday and Thursday from 3 to 5, I think it was, or Monday and Wednesday. That was Hebrew school for me. My mother went to Shuli. She didn't learn Hebrew, she learned Yiddish. It was a very secular type of education, very socialistic. But Shuli was basically like a Yiddish school, but she wanted to talk with her grandmother, who was Yiddish, my great-grandmother, whom I still remember. Judaism says it's not what you do, it's what you do, not what you think. Now remember the Sermon on the Mount? Jesus is saying it's not just committing adultery, it's looking at a woman and lusting after her. It's not just murder, it's getting mad at your brother without reason. He's internalizing religion. Judaism was externalized, which is not what the Old Testament said to do. And to this day, I was going by a church with my mother when I was in my single digits, I guess, and she said, Christians believe it's what you think that's wrong, but we know better. It's only what you do. It's still taught. I got books by Alfred Kolach, I think his name is, Kolach or something. The Jewish Book of Why, the Jewish Book of Why, the second Jewish Book of Why, and he brings that out. It's only what you do. It's not what you think. Mm-hmm. Now, we know from the New Testament that's not true. But Judaism today is what you do. Yeah, it's both. It's both. Now this is maybe not true anymore. American Jews are more religious than Israeli Jews. Now, when I was there in general, we always think of, the Wailing Wall and the religious Jews, but that's such a small minority. Most Jews in Israel, when people came to Israel, the pioneers, it was a very secularized communist movement. My kibbutz in 1979, on May Day, they fly the Israeli flag and the red flag of Marxism. The whole kibbutz movement was Marxist to the core, developed, basically they were copying the Russian kolkhoz. And it's, there was more religious here, Judaism is more emphasized among the Jews here, I guess because over there, you're already there, do you really have to emphasize that you're Jewish? Now, there was a friend of mine that I was on a mission team with in Brockton, Massachusetts. I actually knew her from Bible school, And she had grown up Roman Catholic and became an evangelical Christian. She told me it's the same in Italy. In other words, they're not as religious as they are here. Now, I don't think this is true anymore, and here's the reason. 25% of Israelis now are religious. The percentage has increased dramatically. When I first wrote this, I was thinking about the old days, the 70s, the 80s when I talked to that lady. It's probably not true anymore. Characteristics of the Jewish people today, very egalitarian. You get drafted, boy or girl, or man or woman, and when you're 18, you get out of high school. Think a woman does 2 years in the Army, a man does 3. Then you got reserve duty every year. Lisa, used to be a man for like 30 days every year until he's 55, and a woman until she's 26 and married, whichever comes first. Some of those numbers might have changed. You do not salute your commanding officer, you call him by his first name. They have that, and I've read even more recently. You don't like a commander or something, you can complain, have him removed. It's an extremely, even in America, okay? Women drafted into the Israeli Defense Forces. By the way, one of the things, and I'll mention this towards the end of the presentations, in numbers 12, 13 or something, all these details about why they do so well in business and about the tremendous differences. I've lived in this Jewish egalitarian culture in New England. It's very different than, let's say, when we lived in Texas and stuff. The boss is always right, and that's that. You tell that the Jew, he's going to laugh at you. Maybe. 3 types of settlements. Kibbutz, it's a collective. Pluralist kibbutzim. Okay, kibbutznik is a person who is a member of a kibbutz. Not just someone who shows up for 6 months or a year, but a member. It's also called a chaver, which means friend.
Kibbutznik, that sounds Russian.
Well, that's this thing. It's probably came from the Yiddish part, and then, Hebrew, modern Hebrew, they've had to come up with a whole bunch of new words. And in fact, the Hebrew word for hand grenade is limon, which is pomegranate. But they've had to come up with new words, and sometimes they come from English, and sometimes they come from Yiddish. And that probably went from Russian to Yiddish to Hebrew. Okay, kibbutznik. Now, volunteer is just someone, these young people that show up for 6 months, a year, whatever, they volunteer, often Gentile. Ulpanist. That was me on the Ulpan. 5.5 months work study, trips, seminar, stuff like that. Now, these kibbutzim these days, very much you own your own property, you make your own meals, and all that stuff. When I was there, you ate in the common cafeteria, you didn't own anything, you didn't own a car, you could borrow one. But what's great is that you don't have any boss. And in a sense, if I worked the chicken coops, yeah, I'm kind of your boss. But there's no one up top making all the money. They get together at night and they decide who's going to do what the next day. Extremely egalitarian culture.
Could I clarify something?
Yeah.
So what you're saying is it has a lot of basis of respect because each person is valued for what they contribute.
Exactly. It's so different than the United States. By the way, Israel's more high-tech than we are. We are not the most advanced nation on the planet anymore. We were when I was a kid. That's no longer true. Israel beats anybody. Part of it is because they get in the military and and it's not this top-down leadership. We would have to have it in America. We're fighting in this country and in that country. You ever talk to a veteran and find out we've been fighting in places that aren't even in the history books? Okay, it's interesting that whole thing. Or at least, no one's going to talk about it, but yeah, I was there, and guess what? I had one guy tell me he was visiting his wife at a Christian school where I was teaching, and she was a teacher there. He says, Americans have no idea what's going on over there. And this was, like Bosnia and stuff, whatever that was. He said, well, Obama said we didn't have anybody involved in that. He says, it's my job to get the planes up. He's an Air Force guy. Now, I didn't get specific about Bosnia, so it might not have been what Obama was denying, but what I hear from people who have been in the service is, we were in places you don't know about. Israel, it's very, everyone gets drafted and they have to make decisions at the lower levels. That's how the Israeli army works. You can't wait for Central Command to tell you something.
That's right.
So then they get out and they're so good at business, so good at high tech, and that's one of the reasons. And they just, you know, normally I go to church and I wear a jacket and tie. Okay, I was watching a whole bunch of these videos on health, trying to get my diet in order. And they're all decked out, you know, typically TEDx, but some others. The Israeli guy goes up and he's a physician. He's wearing jeans. I go to a bank in Israel. The guy's got an open shirt, you know, and cigarettes in his pocket and shorts and sandals at a bank in Israel. Now, I think they might not be quite that way now. I know right when I was leaving or so, they got some law that basically says you have to dress decently when you visit a religious site. You can't just go in shorts and stuff. But basically, it's a very egalitarian, informal society. And they will tell you what they think whether you want to hear it or not. No respect. In a sense, it seems like no respect. But Moshav is a cooperative. I worked in a Moshav. I hated it because they were driven by money. Kibbutz, you're not driven by money. Moshav, they're always talking about money. It was an English-speaking kibbutz in the Negev called Kibbutz Stei Nitzan, yeah. All these like South Africans, Americans, stuff like that, you know, and they get certain rules they go by. But you got money in a bank, and you got your own, you know, you're allowed so many dunam of land, they call it, and you can build greenhouses, and they were raising flowers there was the big thing. I also saw some beekeepers. Thought they were terrorists at first. This evening, and it's getting dark, and I'm walking, and these people are in these suits. It's like, man, are they terrorists? No, beekeepers. Well, if you know, you ever see Cast a Giant Shadow, okay? You won't get into that right now, but that really happened. Except that in real life, the American had a sheet around him because he was urinating in the garden. And that's when he was shot for not knowing the password. But there was a guy, I think it was Colonel Mickey Marcus, that went over to Israel around 1948 as sort of an advisor. And he helped Israel, you know, because of the siege of Jerusalem and everything. Okay? Now, in the movie they made about him, he's going out on his wife and he's talking with his girlfriend, and he comes back and the sentry says, because it's nighttime, basically, you know, who are you, what's the password or whatever, and he doesn't know Hebrew. So he doesn't answer and he gets shot and killed, which really, in real life, as I read, he was out in the garden with a sheet around him, taking a leak, and he came back, and that's when he was shot. But the thing is, when you see people with sheets on, you tend to think they're Arabs, so these beekeepers. But anyway, it was so driven by money. But you could get in debt. You know, they'd say, oh, well, our neighbors, you know. But this was just as they were getting into the shekel for the currency. It used to be called the pound or the lira. You know, Hebrew was lira. You know, this guy's, you know, several hundred lira in the bank, and this guy's several hundred in debt, but you could still function like that. It was just like a balance sheet or something. But it was very financially driven, and I didn't like it. But it's a cooperative. It's not a commune. Okay, and there was also settlement towns, which these days are really probably, you know, the West Bank towns. You wanted to live in a settlement town. Remember, when I was there, you got up really early in the morning. Israel starts early, by the way. I spent a night in the bus station in Jerusalem, my second time when I first went there, outside because we had no hotel to sleep in. And by about 6 in the morning, it starts to rustle. By 6:30, it's full-fledged rush hour. They get up early. They'll often, you know, in kibbutz, they might take a nap in the afternoon, siesta. It's Herod's hours, by the way. I think we're like 6 in the morning till 10 in the morning, his office hours when he was there. But it's a settlement town. Went there good and early, found a newspaper, found out where there's an apartment or something, and tried to live there. People wanted to live there. I think these days you have to get accepted. They're generally very religious these days. But those were the three main types of whatever you want to call them, besides the cities and stuff, settlements or whatever. Okay. Kibbutz movement was originally agricultural. It was a socialism that works. I mean, I'm not preaching socialism, but it actually worked for a while. Although they're getting away from it. It's really kind of like almost like a gated community now. You get your own home, you get your own car. There are a few socialistic kibbutzim, but they're socialistic because they make so much money through free enterprise that they can afford to be socialistic. Different pay for different tasks now. Okay, Children used to be raised communally in what they called Bet Yiladim, the children's house, after age 1. Parents got them on the Sabbath. You could also see them in the afternoon. And what happened was, no big boss. Here's what happened. Women were raising the kids. In the early kibbutz movement, here's some of the complaints. We're supposed to be equals. The men, we women are stuck in the kitchen. The men are out in the fields. Wait a minute, we're not really equals, are we? And another complaint that came up eventually was, I'm a woman, I'm raising everybody's kid, I want to raise my own. Okay, so they got away from the children's houses. There is no big boss making money off you. You argue, at least in the old days, you'd argue your way into college, like you'd say to the kibbutz, if you're a member now. Okay, if you send me to college for 2 years or for 4 years, I promise I will stay in this kibbutz for 2 years or for 4 years. I won't withdraw my membership. I need it for maybe working in the children's houses. I need something about childhood education or something like that. And then if you didn't get in, you'd say next year, look, I talked to you guys last year, someone else beat me to it. It's my turn now. You argue. You go up to New England, you go up to New York, and you start talking to the Jewish population, and you're going to think, man, these guys love to argue. You got into college back in those days by arguing your way in. Egalitarian, yes, and they're the most left-wing group in the United States. Unless they're Orthodox. People have noticed this in the past. The ones that really get into their religion are more right-wing because they're going by the Bible. Now, I'm not saying the Bible, the right wing is the same as the Bible. I'm just saying it's closer. So actually, here's the left wing, the right wing, and to me, here's the Bible. It's the third apex of the triangle. It's not anything in between. It's the third apex. Rabbi Daniel Lapin, America's Real War. Orthodox rabbi, has got this organization. He had a radio, maybe he still does, radio broadcast, I think out of Seattle. You'd answer questions. He's got this organization, something like something or other of Christians and Jews. Christians have a lot of respect for him. In the USA, they're educated and studious. More athletic in Israel. Yes, we have had some Jewish professional athletes, but in the United States, but very few. Yeah, I know Sandy Koufax and others, but they're urban due to talents learned during the Middle Ages. You couldn't be a serf in the Middle Ages if you were Jewish. What are you going to do? Pledge allegiance to Jesus? Think you had to do that? You may make some pledge or something. So they became very urbanized. Nobel Prizes. Jews make up 2% of the American population. Now this is dated information. I don't know exactly what it is today. Jews make up 2% of the American population, yet have been awarded 25% of all Nobel Prizes given to Americans, with 40% of the Nobel Prizes given to Americans in science and economics. By the way, the Nobel Peace Prizes, of course, you realize it's a political favor. Mm-hmm. You get a Nobel Prize in science or economics, you got to have something up here. Jews make up about 2% of the Soviet population, about 30% of the doctors, 20% of the engineers, etc. Sephardic Jews were the first ones in the USA. It was a shipload coming from Brazil.
1654.
Yeah, but the majority are Ashkenazi in the USA today. The mother teaches the morals. Now, maybe this isn't what the Bible says, but this is what happens. The mother wears the pants. Unless they're Orthodox. In an Orthodox home, the father wears the pants. And I'm going with a lot of generalities. Can we all agree that men are typically taller than women? It's not always true. It's a generality, okay? It's not always true, but more often than... So I'm going to use a broad brush with a lot of what I say here throughout these seminars. The mother teaches the mother wears the pants, unless they're Orthodox. She teaches the morals, and the father runs the religious ceremony. The father's weak. Okay, I grew up like that. No offense to my father. If my mother wanted something, my father wanted something else. Guess who got their way? But that's typical in non-Orthodox Jewish culture. There were Israeli communities now, Israeli expatriates, like California, Rockland, Maryland. Judaism is a religious belief. Zionism is a political belief about the land of Israel. Some Jews are not Zionists. There are Orthodox Jews living in Israel that think the Messiah has to set up this country. We shouldn't be here trying to set up a country. They refuse to be drafted. When Israel flies planes overhead on a certain holiday, they won't let the kids out to see it, stuff like that. Some Christians are Zionists. So here's what you got. Judaism consists of God, the Torah, the laws and the teachings, the 5 books of Moses, Israel, which is Jewish nationhood, and chosenness, God chose us. This is just something I got from somebody else. Jewish proselytism is not much of an issue today. Now, Jews will try to proselytize, the Orthodox might try to proselytize other Jews to become more Orthodox. They don't try to make converts to Judaism.
Was it ever an issue, really? I mean, when you read the Old Testament, you never see them try to convert people into Israel.
What did Jesus say? Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you compass the land to make one proselyte. That's a Gentile becoming a Jew. Unless what it means is you're trying to make them more like you. But it's probably not what it means. And when he is made, you make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves. Now,
Just trying to grow.
yeah, it probably was at one time a bit of an issue from what Jesus said, if that's what they were really doing, trying to make Gentiles into Jews, as opposed to what a lot of Jews today, you're Jewish, but you're not observant enough, come join us. Non-Jews can live by the 7 laws of Noah. This is according to Jewish doctrine now, which is not to worship idols, not to curse God, not to commit murder. By the way, the Bible does not say thou shalt not kill.
That's right. It says yes.
Thou shalt not murder. Read in Hebrew. It's probably a better translation. Not to commit adultery, bestiality, or sexual immorality, not to steal, not to eat flesh torn from a living animal. The old days, what you'd have is a sheep or something. Relatives come over, take off some of the meat, thing's still living, you let them go around half wounded till the next meal. Yeah, they did stuff like that.
Yeah.
Now that's against Jewish. Jews probably didn't ever do that, but we're talking in the old days. To establish courts of justice. That's the 7 laws of Noah. I'm not saying that the Bible says this is how Gentiles should live. I'm saying this is Jewish doctrine. I don't usually watch TV, but I saw some Rose Bowl game or something. They got a big parade. And someone comes out flashing this big placard, 7lawsofnoah.com. Why have Jewish law? The law of Moses has lots to do with civil law, not just religious law. PCA, Presbyterian Church of America. Now they got some liberalism. Back in those days they didn't. There was a pastor in Jackson, Tennessee. I listened to him. And he stands like this. He says, let's say there's a divorce case and both people co-own a business. What do? You pray about it for a couple of weeks and make a decision. Says the Catholics, and he points back as if there's a bunch of bookcases or something. They got case law. Okay? When you think about it, what do you do with the details? Jewish law exists because here's the Old Testament, says certain things, but what do you do with the details? Jewish law is based on the Torah, that's the 5 books of Moses. Also sometimes means the whole Old Testament. It actually is, Paul talks about the law. Torah means teaching. It does not mean law. But it's so legalistic, it's considered the law. It can supposedly stand for the Bible, Talmud, and later writings. It just depends how it's used. It's a word that has several meanings, like Passover. And the Talmud, 6,000 pages if you translate into English, in later writings. Now this is an oversimplification, but Jewish law is based on this.
Sorry, real quick, what's the Talmud again?
The Talmud is, okay.
Tanakh?
No, Tanakh is the Old Testament. The Talmud is it's 2 parts. There's the Mishnah, okay? That is commentary on the Old Testament. It was all these oral laws that finally got written down around 200 AD under a guy named Yehuda HaNasi, Judah the Prince. Because the temple had been destroyed and they realized Jews are scattered all over. We got to write down what we've only been telling each other. It built a fence around the law. It said, look, for instance, the Bible says, thou shalt not boil a kid in his mother's milk. In other words, you don't take a baby goat, kill it, and boil it in his mother's milk. Well, Jewish law just goes, you can't have milk, you can't mix milk and meat products. My house, we had different plates and different silverware for meat products and milk products. You couldn't have a cheeseburger. Okay, because you're mixing dairy and you're mixing dairy and meat. And we even had Yiddish words for it. And the thing is, this is what Jesus was fighting. All these laws, they said you can't break the law of Moses if you got a fence around it. That fence was a whole bunch of
615, in about 615 laws. Rules.
238 positive, 365 negative, 613 total. And,
Yeah.
well, that's, okay. But there was all these rules that if you couldn't break them, you wouldn't be breaking God's law. It built a fence around the law. Oral law finally got written down. And then there was commentary on that called the Gemara, which was added to the Mishnah. The Gemara sometimes is called the Talmud, like Mishnah and Talmud. Sometimes the Talmud means both, the Mishnah and Talmud. So Talmud has two meanings.
The Talmud is not a portion of the Bible.
No, it's commentary on it. In other words, what's interesting is the Talmud's got some really interesting history that's very relevant to Christians, to what was going on during the time of Jesus. But it's also, there's a lot of commentary, there's a lot of what they call agudat, legends. You know, Abraham says something or other, and God turns his dog into the devil, and it's all this stuff that you hear. Abraham as a kid up in Ur of the Chaldeans, in his hometown, his father says, watch the idol shop, and Abraham takes a stick and breaks all the idols except the biggest, and the father comes home and says, what happened? Abraham says he did it, the biggest idol. Idols can't do that. Why do you worship them? Okay, these are all these stories, commentaries, much of which can really confuse your understanding of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And then that's like the Mishnah, and then the Gemara gets even more of like how to interpret the Mishnah. You know, it's just layer of legalism, but some good history in there.
How do you spell Gemara?
Gemara. I think it's an Aramaic word, means like finish or something like that.
And that's all the stuff that Jesus was fighting.
Kamaz, I finished. Kamati, huh?
That's all
Jesus
stuff.
was fighting that.
All that stuff.
Yeah, which
Yeah.
eventually got written down after the destruction of the Second Temple. Because there were other areas outside Jerusalem which had Jewish communities, and the rabbis got together and put it down. These rabbis were generally Pharisees. The Sadducees didn't survive that, the destruction of the temple. So Judaism today is based on the Babylonian Talmud. Now there's also a Jerusalem Talmud, it's also called the Palestinian Talmud, which is shorter. It is, when the two disagree, the Babylonian Talmud is considered authoritative. It was not written, the Jerusalem Talmud was not written in Jerusalem, it's just what they call it. Usually it's the Babylonian Talmud that Judaism is based on, modern Judaism. There are also some later writings, and we'll get into those more. Why have Jewish law? Okay, I'm going backward, pushing the wrong things. Principles of justice laid down in the Bible. That's part of Jewish law, elaborated in the Talmud. Codified, look at those years, 1138 to 1204 AD was a guy named Maimonides, very well respected in Judaism. His work and other sources of traditional Jewish law. Rabbis say that the written law is 613 commandments, 248 are positive and 365 are negative. Talmud is oral law. Kibbutz movement was originally agricultural. Oral tradition. It was a socialism that works. I mean, I'm not preaching socialism, but it actually applications for a while. Although they're getting away from it. Custom often takes precedence over established law when drafted. Conflict. When Israel flies planes overhead on a certain holiday, they don't let the kids out. Talmudic tractate, stuff like that. That's what it says. Some Christians are Zionists. Now you're talking, so here's what you got. You know, these rabbis that just spend all their time going over details. Judaism consists of God, the Torah, the laws and teaching. What's the Talmud? Hardly heard about it. The modern state of Israel, statehood was achieved on May 14, 1948. The USA was the first country to grant it de facto recognition. In other words, you exist. We're not going to exchange ambassadors, but we know you're there. That was Truman. Okay? De jure recognition, in other words, okay, we're going to recognize that you're legitimate, let's exchange ambassadors, stuff like that, was extended on January 31st, 1949. The Soviet Union was the first country to grant de jure recognition to Israel on the 17th of May 1948, followed by Nicaragua, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Poland. The United States extended de jure recognition after the first Israeli election on January 31st, 1949. The Soviets wanted to see them as allies. I mean, so many of them were from Russia. Israel was full of these kibbutzim. Back then it was probably 25% of the population of Israel. And Andrei Gromyko was real pro-Israel. He later turned against Israel. And the whole Soviet Union turned against Israel. Christian beliefs about the Jews today. They aside, the Jews killed Christ. Well, actually, Vatican II said that's not true. But that's how what existed for a long time. Reformed theology, which is really based on how Augustine interpreted Paul and Jesus to some extent, then went to Luther, and then it went to Calvin. So they have certain beliefs about the Jews, which basically it's that, no big deal. God's done with them. Replacement theology.
This group next door is Reformed theology. And when we had a discussion with them, they walked in here and we were talking about letting them use this area. And I had the Tetragrammaton up here, and
Yeah.
he started making comments that were anti-Semitic.
Oh yeah, they don't like.
Oh,
It's
and you could tell there was something wrong here. Talk about, you need to read this book about the Jews. They're evil, blah, 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 blah. And
I don't tolerate anti-Semitism. I'm on Facebook. Spend a lot of time there. I will talk. I don't care if the person's an atheist. I don't care what the. I mean, as far as Facebook goes, they can be atheistic. They can, including relatives and whatever, friends. They can have different philosophies on life than me, different religious views. One anti-Semitic remark, they're unfriended forever. Okay, I don't tolerate that.
yeah,
But I have been a member of Reformed churches, at least one. I mean, I've gone to several.
I grew up in a Reformed church.
Okay, so they tend, it's not all of them, and it's not so much today, but they tend to be, see, what Augustine said in his, really, the City of God, I guess is where he wrote that. If all the promises that God gave to Israel that haven't been fulfilled have been transferred to the church, that's replacement theology. It's not true. I don't see how you can look at Israel today and still believe it, but old heresies die hard. Replacement theology. Dispensationalism does see a difference between Israel and the church. Even John MacArthur calls himself a dispensationalist. He's a Calvinist. Because he said, and I've read this, I've read the Gospel according to Jesus, the Gospel according to the Apostles, and one of them, he says that's why he's a dispensationalist. He does see a difference. He says, in essence, that's what dispensationalism is. Some people say that Christianity is parenthetical. Now, these are the people that, they might get on TV. Well, God has, we're Gentiles and it's just temporary and then God's going to go back to the Jews. This is a parenthetical thing, kind of like Plan B, like Plan A where the Jews were supposed to take the gospel and they blew it, so now it's going to us. Okay? I think that's a little extreme, and I'll tell you why. Check out Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews. Now, I know the Reformed group loves Romans, Galatians, Hebrews, and actually early Ephesians because they use it to prove their doctrines. But when I actually read those, I realize Christianity is not some parenthetical thing. I know God's going to go back to the Jews in the millennium, but it's not a parenthetical thing. And you get everything in between. You get the whole continuum.
Jesus didn't come to start a new religion. It was supposed to be the completion of Hebraic Judaism, not rabbinical Judaism.
That's the important difference. And then, I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and also my covenant with Isaac, and also my covenant with Abraham will I remember. And I will remember the land. That's Leviticus 26:42, and that happens to be the chapter where it shows when the rightful heirs are there, the land flourishes. When they're not, the land's destroyed. You can see that in the last few hundred years of history. So, any comments? That was a much shorter one.
Okay.
Any comments, questions?
No.
Okay, and I'm sorry if I took too long, but
Nope.